That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The British Constitution provides that taxation and representation shall go together. Therefore, women taxpayers are entitled to vote.
I have a dream today. Let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true.
Hello and welcome to the Only Human podcast. Episode 54, I think, is where we're at today. And today we're going to continue with our discussion about self-discovery and getting to know yourself. And we're going to talk about inspiration. Where does it come from? Where does it go? How can we develop it ourselves? How can we self-inspire? So I think for me, inspiration is absolutely critical because I'm a writer, I'm a content creator. And if I do not have some form of inspiration, I can't earn a living anymore. Maybe I could, but I need to be routinely inspired. And it seems to be a dwindling pot for me lately. And so I thought about this in some depth and thought we'd give it a go here for episode 54. So I think it's important that we answer a few questions in this podcast. I want to know where inspiration comes from. I want to know how I can make it last longer. And I want to know how I can cultivate it, how I can self-inspire my ability to create, to embrace new ways of looking at things. And that's really, really difficult for me. It happens all the time, but not by anything I do to myself. So those are some of the core questions we want to look at today. And because this was so cool and I didn't have a blue threat proverb to match it, I created a new one with a quote from Pablo Picasso. And I'm not sure what number this blue threat proverb is, but here's what it says. Inspiration exists, but it has to find you working. It's not enough just to be the spark. It has to be a spark that drives something. So Picasso told us that inspiration definitely exists, but it has to find you working, meaning there's something more that we have to embrace in order to become inspired. So I think there's an important distinction here, and most of you know I'm a word guy, right? Whether it's airmanship or professionalism or discipline or all those words, I try to make sure we understand clearly. For me, there's two words that sound similar, but I think they're different, and that's inspiration and motivation, right? Can I be inspired but not motivated? Can I be motivated and not inspired? And I think the answer to both those questions is yes. And I'd like to dive into that a little bit more. Inspiration is something that happens inside of me, right? It's some almost spontaneous feeling or idea that hits me emotionally, right? Or maybe intellectually, or maybe both. Right? It comes from something inside me, a connection to whatever little pool of creativity that remains in me. Some new perspective will inspire me, right? It's often sparked by something else, something I see, something I hear. I'm inspired a lot by music lyrics or poetry, art, nature, all kinds of things. So that's inspiration. It's sort of a spark. Motivation, on the other hand, I think is typically tied to maybe something external. It's beyond being inspired, right? It's the push to take action. It's the push to complete something, to achieve some desired outcome. It can be reward-based, right? I'm motivated to finish a book so that I can get it out there and start to get some feedback from the public. Inspiration is seldom reward-based, right? And motivation can be tied to a deadline, right? I'm motivated to get everything done in time to go watch the Lions beat up on the Dallas Cowboys yesterday. Man, was that a fun game. So inspiration momentary, typically triggered by something, typically unplanned. Motivation, on the other hand, is something we use following the inspiration, right? In order to allow that inspiration to take root and drive some sort of desired outcome. There's a second thing, I think, about the difference between the two words. Inspiration tends, at least to me, to invoke some feeling of excitement. Oh, wow, I can do this, right? But it doesn't automatically lead me to do anything. It's more about generating a state of mind. Where motivation is where you sit down, you plan it out, right? What steps do I have to do to take this inspiration and move it forward? Right? How can I push through challenges? Stay on track, right? Even when things get tough. Right? Motivation's often linked to resolve. You've heard me, I love that word. Discipline, determination, expecting challenges to arise and pushing right through them. The third thing I think that is different between those two words is how long they last, right? Inspiration can be fleeting, right? I can have a moment of inspiration and then it's gone. A burst of energy around this idea, but it fades quickly if I don't do something with it. Like I said, it's a spark. It doesn't stay lit. And motivation tends to be, for me at least, excuse me, a lot more enduring, especially if it is inspired by something that I really think is maybe a breakthrough idea or a new way of looking at things. So the last thing I'll use here to kind of differentiate between inspiration and motivation is I like to see inspiration as the vision and motivation as the fuel, right? The vision where I see something new is possible. I'll give you an example. I've been inspired for about the past 2 weeks, off and on, by basically what I'm seeing as a decay in our culture that's clearly visible by the way people dress in public. Right? I see people on airplanes in pajamas. I see people in the grocery stores and restaurants in ways that even 10 years ago, you would never see anybody dressed so, dare I say, casually. And so what I did was I got online, I went back, and I started looking at pictures from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And you can just see decade by decade how our care and our attention to how we look in public has decayed. So that was the inspiration for me asking the following question. I wonder if it's only on the outside we've decayed. I wonder if our character, our ethics, our moral grounding, our commitment, our ability to think, our ability to care, empathy. I wonder if those things that are less visible have also decayed. My hypothesis is that, yeah, probably. But then there's this old guy thing going on that says everybody says that their generation was better than the next generation. So I'm fighting that. But that's the difference between inspiration. I'm inspired to look into this idea. And the motivation is, let's go find some research on character and ethics and morals and empathy that's historical, right? And not all that stuff is present, so it's kind of tough to find it. So that's the key difference between inspiration and motivation, right? As we kind of look forward and to talk about where does inspiration come from, I'll give you another personal example just from yesterday. It actually happened before the Dallas Cowboys game. I watched SpaceX launch the Starship and catch that first stage booster almost 200 feet tall with a pair of chopsticks. And I thought I was watching a science fiction movie. And many of you know that I write nonfiction books, but most of you don't know that I also write novels. And I instantly thought, man, I got to write a space opera, right? I want to take the starship and create something. Now, the problem with a space opera is typically they got to be about 500 to 700,000 words long, and that's a year of everyday writing for me. And I'm not sure I got the motivation to tie into that inspiration, but that's how it happens, right? You see something, you get excited, and then you've got to do the hard work of figuring out whether you can sustain it. So inspiration comes from a lot of different places, man. It's watching the Starship launch yesterday. It's hearing a music lyric. It's seeing something in nature that sparks some new idea, or maybe it's a really cool new plot angle from a book or a movie. One of the things we know from neuroscience is that inspiration invokes a dopamine release, right? So it lights up a center in our brain that makes us feel inspired. It makes us feel good when we're inspired. And that emotional resonance can last as long as you continue to feed that inspiration, right? I told you that a few weeks ago I started thinking about the decay of our society based on how people dress. Well, that's led me to some online searches for different things that might verify or refute that hypothesis. And every time I find something, it's just another hit of that dopamine, right? So I feel re-inspired. So here's something I'd ask you to think about. Think about the last time you were really inspired by anything. Maybe it's a speaker, a book, a movie, anything. Think about the last burst of inspiration. 3 questions. Can you remember what it felt like? Right? Question 2. First of all, do you remember what it was? Right? That's question 1. Question 2, do you remember what it felt like? And question 3, maybe the most important one, what did you do with it? Did you decide to pursue something, start something new, change the way you're currently doing something? Which leads us to our next segment here. Because if we don't do something with the inspiration, it will fade. The dopamine will wash out of our system. If we don't intentionally try to refuel it and re-inspire it, it fades. So where does it go? Where does inspiration go when it disappears? And I feel this routinely in my writing career. And it's referred to by a common phrase a lot of authors know, every author knows, writer's block, right? A creative block that's, I don't know whether it's part burnout, part distraction, or whether it's just natural. The way I kind of like to view it, because every once in a while I'll have a writer's block that will last a long time. I just recently finished a book called Armored Knight. I've been working on it for 5 years. And people say, wow, that's a long time to work on a book. And I have to be honest with you, I didn't really work on it for those 5 years. I let it sit for 6, 8 months at a time because I got into one of these creative blocks where I said, how am I going to fit this together? It makes no sense, right? I can't. And rather than take that challenge on, I let it go. I was busy doing other things. This book should have been finished 2 years ago and would have made a lot of difference to a lot of people if it was, I think. But I had that creative block. So I began to think of inspiration and motivation sort of tied to another metaphor, that of a campfire, right? When you're starting a fire, whether it's in a fire pit or wherever it is, you have to get it going with a small amount of light fuels, sticks, twigs, kindling. But that will light quickly, but it will burn out fairly fast, right? It'll flicker. A good strong wind can blow it out. So a fire needs tending. And tending means you've got to shape that fire, make sure you've got the heat underneath the new fuel that you're putting on top. You need to put progressively bigger sticks and logs on until it really starts going. And even then, with the big logs in, every 45 minutes or so, you've got to take a poker and adjust it and put another log on. So that's how I see the link between inspiration and motivation. You can get inspired, which is lighting the fire, right? But then tending that fire is motivation. I mentioned the example of writing Armored Knight. That spark dimmed in me when I chased 2 or 3 inspiring ideas fairly quickly, one right after the other. I had this idea that mental health needed to be something that was for everyone, not just for people that were suffering, that we could become more fulfilled and happier, and frankly, preventative medicine against mental health problems for challenges we face in life. And so that was the first part. And so it was just a matter of codifying and rewriting a lot of stuff that I knew was true out there that could be applied by your average Joe. But then I had this idea that I see so many people fall off the professionalism ladder or even life ladder when they get apathetic and frustrated, and eventually that leads to them becoming cynical, right? Cynicism, that deep diabolical pride where you no longer care what the world thinks. Maybe people that are cynical are the people that start dressing that way on airplanes. I don't know. See how we tied that all together there? But that didn't fit with the other stuff, right? And then I got this idea also that of an infinite battle that we're in that never ends, right? That no matter what we do, it's going to continue even long after we're off this plane of existence. And so that was important to me, to get this timeless nature of a fight between good and evil and average and excellence and all those things. And so I developed all 3 of those things pretty well. But then I looked at them over and over again. And I said, man, this is 3 books, not 1. What are you doing? What are you thinking? And I let it sit, right? My inspiration had fired up 3 different times, and then it faded. I became sort of exhausted with the project, almost gave up on it. But then I, sat and stared at these things month after month, and finally was re-inspired by something that I saw on TV, actually, about how things could be put together that don't naturally fit. It was one of those crime dramas, right? 3 apparent unrelated things that the master detective figured out. She put them all together and it made sense. And so that kind of re-inspired me to think about, hey, if this were a crime scene, the book that didn't get written or something like that, how could I weave this all together? And it happened, right? And once I'd done that, I got a chance to go back through the whole thing and put in little transitions and reflections back to previous sections. All that stuff turned out pretty good, I think. So anyways, all of that to say, we all get frustrated, but we can't give up because of a lack of inspiration, because inspiration can lead to wonderful things, but we have to be able to plan on how to use that. So what if I hadn't seen that crime drama with a brilliant detective solving all that for me? I mean, is there any way that we can self-inspire? And as I was getting ready for this podcast, I started thinking about some things that I do. And they may work for you, they may not. And I'd love to hear what you do to get new inspiration. One is I change my location, right? I've got a really nice office here. It's a great workspace, but every once in a while I get tired of it. And so I bought one of those sort of outdoor, what do you call them, gazebo things. It's made of metal with scrolled metal, all that stuff. I have a piece of concrete out there in my yard that I wasn't using for anything. And I put it up out there, and I put together a little work area. I call it Buck Miles' office. Buck Miles, for those of you who don't know, is the pseudonym I write fiction under. And so I called this thing Buck's Office. And whenever I'm struggling with something, work related or otherwise, I don't just use it for Buck Miles stuff, but I go out there and I sit outdoors. My dogs come up, they hang around me, and I get a little burst of energy, right? So change your location. Try that. I know a lot of people will go and work at a Starbucks or something like that. Whatever works for you. The second thing that works for me is I need to get off my butt and move, right? Some physical activity, even a simple walk, right? I've got a pretty nice bike and rowing machine over here, not too far from where I'm at, and that'll really get me going. So physical activity always helps. The third thing is get out of your normal routine of the things you read and the things you know. Part of my going to sleep at night is I read for 15 or 20 minutes. That helps put me to sleep. But I always tend to read the same things. I read crime thrillers, and I read science fiction. Every once in a while, I've got to change that up because really there are about 4 plot lines that get regurgitated with different characters in different locales. And so I'll read something different, maybe some nonfiction, maybe something that is more of a mystery than a thriller. And that changes my mindset quite a bit just before I go to sleep and changes the way I dream. So try that. Try learning something new, reading something different. And then the last thing, and I say this all the time, I reflect a lot on my work because it's part of how I get better. And so I write stuff down. Whenever I get a really inspired moment, hey, how did that happen? I'll write that down. Not necessarily always able to recreate that moment, but definitely something that helps me. And then the other thing is sometimes I'll just, my best friend and partner in all of this stuff is my wife, Sherry, and I'll just come in and say, I can't think of anything, right? This is just really giving me a hard time right now. And just sharing that and getting it off my chest. Sometimes she'll have an idea. Sometimes she'll say, quit being a baby and get back to work. But most of the time, she has a couple words of wisdom and she knows my frustration. So that is a wonderful thing if you've got somebody like that you can share with. Excuse me. I did some mowing yesterday and inhaled a lot of dust, and so I'm still coughing it up. And then there's the inspiration that comes from the challenges of life, right? I think one of the most famous stories of reigniting inspiration during a tough time is author J.K. Rowling. If you don't know her, she wrote all the Harry Potter books, right? Probably doing pretty well in life right now. But she wasn't always, right? She faced really, really serious personal and financial hardships. She was a single mom. I think she was living on welfare. She struggled with depression. And despite all those challenges, she found the inspiration to write. And she once said, rock bottom became the solid foundation from which I rebuilt my life. Rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life. So she didn't give up, which is the key thing there, right? In the midst of her despair, she found the solitude and time she needed to start something. And then she found the inspiration of being pretty good at it, right? She'd sit in a small cafe, maybe pouring her energy into writing the first Harry Potter book. And there are times, and I think, we know this from lots of great authors, of which I'm not one, when the blue side of their life inspires some great work. I mean, I think of authors like Graham Greene, Our Man in Havana, great book, Ernest Hemingway, all wrote from personal pain, right? And they wrote very, very well. And I'm certain that even though they were suffering a lot, when they looked at some of the stuff they did, they got that momentary dopamine hit and said, this is pretty good. So minor joys amidst the depression, but sometimes you can find it there. I think J.K. Rowling's a great example. So let me kind of bring this to some sort of conclusion. Inspiration can come from a lot of places. Oftentimes it's unexpected, right? People, experiences, sometimes, like we just pointed out, even struggles. Inspiration fades, but that's natural and that's okay. What matters is that we recognize it for what it is, and then we take steps to keep the campfire tended, right? And that's how we move from inspiration to motivation. And there are some tangible ways that we can self-inspire, right? We can get up and get moving. We can change environments. We can read new things, watch new things, listen to new things. We can reflect a little bit on the things that have worked for us in the past. I want to finish on kind of what I hope is a hopeful message. Because I'll tell you, there are times during those creative blocks when I get downright pissed off at myself. You know, you're better than this. Why can't you think? That's the stupidest line I've ever read. And that is, there's power in action. There is power in action. Back to what Picasso told us in the Blue Thread Proverb of the Week, inspiration exists, but it better find you at work, right? We all have a muse, something that will ignite our creativity, our innovation. But that muse only visits us when we're doing something that it's interested in, right? And I know I do a lot of, what's the word? Anthropomorphic. That's when you make things seem human that aren't. But I'm not sure that a muse is not some sort of intelligent entity out there watching me, deciding whether or not I deserve its inspiration. So try anything that we've talked about today. But most of all, recognize those moments of inspiration in your own life and enjoy the good feeling that it gives you. And beyond that, try to figure out the discipline of thought and action on how you can take some things that inspire you, especially if they're things that open outward, right, to help others to connect in some greater way with the world around us, because Lord knows we can all use more of that. All right, so just to kind of wrap this all up, we talked about inspiration, we talked about motivation, we talked about different ways that we can try to stay inspired or get inspired. And we're going to continue this train of thought with a really deeper look at motivation, and see that's something people have studied a lot. And we're going to use 2 or 3 different studies. Chip and Dan Heath wrote some great books on internal versus external motivation and how we can leverage both. And we're going to take this idea of inspiration and motivation to the next level when we meet next week, Tuesday, 9 o'clock, where we're going to drive even deeper in doing what we always do here, which is helping us become better where we are with the resources at hand. I will see you soon.